hit record and get started, and welcome Dom Roche to our marine science seminar series. So I met Dom on Lizard Island on the Great Barrier Reef in 2012 when he was doing some, well, we were both doing some fish ecology research, and we've kind of kept in touch since then through conferences, and I always look forward to reading his papers. He's an accomplished fish behavioural ecologist and physiologist, but today we've asked him to talk about his other interest, which is the need for open science. I'm sure many of us with various levels of enthusiasm have uploaded data sets to accompany our papers, and Dom's going to talk to us a little bit about best practices in that field. So Dom did his bachelor's and master's at McGill in Canada, and then moved to Australia for his PhD and postdoc at Australian National University, and then moved to Switzerland and worked in the lab of Radwan Bashari, working on various behavioural questions, and now is on a Marie Curie fellowship back in Canada, associated with Steve Cook's lab at Carleton. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dom. Thanks for talking to us. And if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we can call on you at the end, or we can just go around for what I'm sure can be an extended Q&A for those of you who still have questions. So thanks a lot. I'll mute myself and hand it over to Dom.
Thanks very much for the intro, Al. I hope everyone can hear me okay. This is my first talk on Zoom, actually, so you'll have to be forgiving if there's any mishaps here. I've done one of these on Skype already, but this is a bit of a change. But yeah, like I'm very very pleased and very grateful that Al and Matt both invited me to give this talk. Like Alistair mentioned, my background is in aquatic ecology, mainly behavior and physiology, but my career has taken a bit of a turn, I guess, in the last few years, and I tend to work a lot now on questions related to open science and mainly data sharing, so open data. I still do work on fish, but I'd say I spend my time 50-50 working on these two different fields, and the Marie Curie Fellowship I hold now is specifically to work on questions related to data sharing. And so, yeah, today I'm going to give you, I guess, a bit of a general intro to open science, and talk about some of the research that I've been doing, some of the empirical research I've been doing on this topic. So let's get started. As you can see, the title of my talk is Why We Need Open Science. And you'll obviously notice that it's a statement rather than a question. And that's because as an early career researcher, I really strongly believe that open science is the way of the future. And I guess my hope from this talk is that I'll be able to convince you of that in the next 45 minutes or so. So I realize that not everyone is necessarily familiar with all the different aspects of open science. And for that reason, I've divided my talk into three different sections. First, I want to tell you a little bit about what open science is and why we should engage in open science practices. Then I want to talk about, like, concretely, how does one go about doing science in a more open and transparent fashion? And then finally, I'm going to spend some time talking about open data specifically, and some of the research that I've been doing into the challenges and the solutions to sharing research data, both amongst ourselves, so amongst scientists, but also with the public. So first, what is open science? There's a bunch of definitions floating out there in the literature and on the internet. And here's the short version that I've put together. So open science involves adopting practices that improve the transparency, credibility, and reuse potential of research results. And there's a number of different ways that we can do this, either by sharing code, sharing data, making our materials and our methods more transparent, engaging in something that's called preregistration. I'll explain what that is in a bit, and also by trying to make our papers openly accessible, and the results of our studies, basically publications, openly accessible to everyone. Open access is probably the component of open science that people are the most familiar with. It's also kind of a beast of its own. And so for that reason, I'm actually not going to talk about it in this presentation, because it requires a presentation of its own. But if there are questions specifically related to that, obviously I'm happy to discuss open access later on. All right, so let's get right into it. Why do we need open science? And the answer to this question is fairly straightforward. It's because we have a problem in science right now. And this problem is called the reproducibility crisis, whereby a worryingly large proportion of research results across a range of different scientific disciplines cannot be independently replicated. So you'll notice that I used reproducibility and replicated or replication interchangeably here. Sometimes the reproducibility crisis is referred to as a replication crisis. They have slightly different meanings, but at the end of the day, I think that the people mean the same thing when they allude to this. Reproducibility has to do with whether someone is able to arrive at the same results if you were to provide them with the data and tell them what types of analyses you had conducted. Replication is slightly different in that if I was to share with you one of my research papers and tell you, well, why don't you read it and then figure out what I did and go ahead and try to repeat my experiments or my observational study as best you can, and we'll see whether you arrive at the same conclusions as I did. So let me illustrate how serious this replication or reproducibility crisis is. In psychology and biomedical science, it's estimated that at least 2/3 of published findings are incorrect. So this is a fairly large number. There's a bunch of different papers that support this figure. I'll give you two examples to kind of illustrate this. The first one is a comment by Begley and Ellis in 2012, published in Nature. And here, these authors documented a large effort that their groups and others conducted to try and replicate 53 landmark studies in cancer research. So these are foundational studies in oncology. And the results of this really large effort showed that only 6 studies, 11% of these 53 landmark papers, were successfully replicated. Fairly shocking. So most recently, in 2015, this paper was published in Science. It was authored by a group that calls itself the Open Science Collaboration. You might have heard about this paper. There was a lot of media attention about it. And this group here tried to estimate the reproducibility of psychological science. So they did this by looking at 100 studies in 3 psychology journals using high-power designs, so larger sample sizes than the original studies, and the same materials as the original studies whenever that was possible. So their results showed that only 39% of effects were rated to have replicated the original results. I don't know how you feel about this, but I find it fairly concerning, especially because psychology and biomedicine are 2 fields that have direct impacts on human health and welfare. So if you're not convinced, let me read you a quote by Richard Horton, who's the editor-in-chief of The Lancet. The Lancet is probably the most respected journal in medicine, along with the New England Journal of Medical Sciences. And in 2015, the editor-in-chief, Richard Horton, wrote this editorial. So he wrote, "The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn toward darkness." Now, I think we all agree that this is a fairly dramatic statement, but I think it carries a lot of weight because it comes from someone as important and as respected as the editor-in-chief of The Lancet. And by the way, Richard Horton is still the editor of The Lancet 5 years later, and he was quoted all over the newspapers recently criticizing Trump's response to cutting funding from the WHO just yesterday. Okay, so reproducibility is clearly a problem in psychology and in biomedicine, but how serious is it in our field, in ecology and evolution? And that obviously includes marine sciences. Well, the answer is we don't really know. Why? Because there's only a handful of replication studies in ecology and evolution. And this was shown just a few months ago by Clint Kelly, who's based at UQAM here in Montreal, where I work. And he used text mining to scour through almost 40,000 open access papers across 160 journals in ecology and evolution. He found that only 9 papers, so 0.02% of these almost 40,000 papers, claimed to have replicated a previous study. So Obviously, this is only the open access literature because Clint was using text mining, but I spoke with him and I asked him what he thought about the whole of the literature in ecology and evolution, paywalled and open access. And he was pretty confident in saying he thinks the replication rate is far less than 0.1% across all of that body of literature. So if you find this surprising, here's another shocking statistic. There was only sufficient statistical detail in the original replication study pairs to calculate 3 effects. So 2 of these 3 effects replicated, which is a 66% success rate. Now, with a sample size of 3, we're doing much better than in other fields, but that totally discounts the fact that most studies don't provide necessary information to test whether their results can be replicated. So here's an example of a recent high-profile replication study that wasn't included in Clint's analysis. Many papers over the last 3 decades or so have reported very strong effects of color bands used to mark zebra finches, which you can see here. Some colors, like red, are used as a textbook example of how artificial color can change male or female attractiveness in zebra finches, and this can increase their reproductive success. In 2018, the authors of this study tested a sample size of 730 birds, which is a lot more than the combined sample size of all the 23 papers that had clearly supported this color band effect hypothesis. And the results showed that band color doesn't explain any of the variance in either male or female attractiveness. Here's another example from January of this year. So 3 months ago, some colleagues and I published a paper that caused a bit of a stir in our field. This was a 3-year replication study by 7 people looking at how end-of-century levels of ocean acidification affect fish behavior. And we tested over 900 fishes across 6 species and 2 life stages. And we looked at the 3 most common behaviors that had been examined by previous studies. We looked at fish avoidance of predator chemical cues. We looked at activity levels and also something called behavioral lateralization, which is the preference of fishes for turning left or right when they're facing an obstacle. So we filmed all of the behaviors that we measured. We used automated tracking software to extract all of the data from these videos and remove any potential observer biases. And we made all of our data and code publicly accessible on an online repository. So like the title says, we found no evidence that ocean acidification disrupts the normal behavior of these fishes. And what's really striking is that this contradicts a whole suite of high-profile studies reporting very serious effects of ocean acidification on reef fish behavior, including the very striking effect that fish are attracted to the chemical cues of their predators in acidified waters. So one thing that we could argue is that irreproducible results in ecology and evolution might not have the same consequences for human welfare as irreproducible results in medicine and psychology. But irreproducibility can have devastating effects on the public's perception of scientists, and it can also promote mistrust and denials on really important topics like evolution, climate change, overfishing, pollution, etc. So I can go on and on, presenting you with more studies and opinion pieces that have been written by experts to document the scale of this reproducibility or replication crisis. But if I was to do this, I think we'd be here until tomorrow morning. So instead, what I want to do is ask this question: what does the average scientist think? Experts seem to think that the replication crisis is a major issue, but what about the non-specialists like you and I that don't necessarily study this question every day? Well, the journal Nature tried to answer this question with a survey of over 1,500 researchers across a range of different fields. And the results were published in 2016 in an editorial piece called Reality Check on Reproducibility. So rather than tell you about these results myself, I'm going to show you a very short video that Nature produced, which is an excellent summary of the results. And I hope that if somehow you can't hear this, Al, please unmute yourself and let me know.
We can't hear anything at the moment. I think you have to
it's not working.
Allow your computer to play computer sound.
Oh wow! All right. What I might do is take my headset off, and hopefully. How would I do this otherwise in Zoom? Allow computer to play. I should have tested this out with you before. What if I try this here? Wait a sec. I'm going to up the volume on here.
Moves forward through corroboration when researchers verify others' results. But 70%.
Not working?
Yeah, that works fine.
Okay, perfect. So let me restart this then.
Is there a reproducibility crisis in science? Nature asked 1,500 researchers this question as part of an online survey. Half agreed there's a significant crisis, and many more identified a slight crisis. Science moves forward through corroboration when researchers verify others' results. But 70% of researchers who took our survey said they tried and failed to reproduce another group's experiments. And even when trying to reproduce their own work, just over half said they couldn't. Does this mean that most published research is wrong? Our respondents don't think so. Most still trust published results in their field, with physicists and chemists the most confident. There are many reasons why researchers may fail to reproduce results. Sometimes a small difference like shaking or stirring a sample can lead to different outcomes. But the biggest reason, according to our survey, is selective reporting. Things like cherry-picking data to support a pet hypothesis. To get to grips with reproducibility, we need better mentorship, proper use of statistics, and more robust experimental design. All these approaches got ringing endorsements in our survey. Whether it's a crisis or not, right now lots of people are paying attention to reproducibility. That makes it a good time for everyone, funders, publishers, scientists, and the institutions they work for, to act. Read more and delve into the survey data at nature.com/news.
Okay. Microphone, so hopefully you can hear me now. Great. So I really like this video because I think it's a great summary of some of the potential problems that lead to this reproducibility crisis. And also there's a short presentation about potential solutions, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I just wanted to highlight here one figure that I find particularly interesting is that there are only 3% of these 1,576 researchers who were able to confidently say, no, they don't believe that there is a reproducibility crisis in science. Now, maybe this is pure coincidence, but just so you know, that's also around the ballpark estimate of how many people fabricate data in science. And so you can make of this whatever you want. So researchers are not the only ones who are alarmed by this problem. The public is also taking notice. And this is pretty clear from articles that have been published in well-known magazines and newspapers like The Atlantic, The Economist, and The New York Times. And because of this, the reproducibility crisis is also often referred to as a credibility crisis. I think this was first coined by Victoria Stoughton, who's a very well-known figure in the field of computational reproducibility. So this is what pops up when you search for credibility crisis on Google. But Donald Trump aside, it's really critical that scientists avoid losing the public's confidence like this, because at a time of post-truth politics, widespread pollution, climate change, and increasing anti-vaccination movements, science can't afford a credibility crisis. There's so many pressing societal issues that need solving right now. And we see this with the pandemic at the moment. And science is a big part of the answer. But to be effective, science needs strong believers, including politicians and members of the public. So why do we have such a crisis on our hands? And again, the answer here is fairly simple. We live at a time where the culture in academia can be described by three very famous words that I'm sure you all know very well: publish or perish. So we know that funding agencies and universities are putting a lot of pressure on researchers to churn out a lot of papers, and preferably in highly prestigious journals. And this has led to what some people call the natural selection of bad science, where selection for high output leads to poorer methods and increasingly high false discovery rates. Now, you might wonder, well, why is it that researchers who want to publish in prestigious journals would use poor research practices? And that's because oftentimes these practices will allow you to find results that are more easily publishable in prestigious journals. So what are these poor research practices, or as Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, calls bad research behaviors? There's a whole suite of them, and they're very well described in an excellent paper by Tim Parker that was published in Tree in 2016. I won't have time to cover them all, obviously, but I want to mention a few very briefly that I think are particularly important. So for starters, confirmation bias is the widespread human tendency to preferentially search for and interpret observations as consistent with one's beliefs about how the world works. This is problematic, obviously, because it means that researchers aren't impartial when they're investigating research questions, and they'll tend to favor their pet hypothesis, either consciously or unconsciously. And the consequence of this is an increase in the rate of false discoveries. Selective reporting is another issue that was mentioned in the Nature video we just saw earlier, and this amounts to reporting only a subset of hypotheses tested. Now, anyone who's taken basic biostatistics class will know that the more statistical tests or the more hypotheses that you carry out, the greater your likelihood of finding a significant result just by chance, if you're using significance testing. And therefore, if you find one or two tests to be significant, and that's all you report in your paper, but you fail to mention the 20 or 30 other tests you carried out, obviously this results in an increase in false positives in the literature. Another poor research practice that's on par with selective reporting is something called p-hacking. And I love this cartoon because I think it says it all. It reads, if you torture the data long enough, they will confess. And we all know, probably anyone who's done statistics before and played around with them will know that, oftentimes it's possible to tweak your stats in so many different ways to get that magic p-value smaller than 0.05 that journals love so much. So formally, p-hacking is defined as a variety of practices that increase the odds of finding a statistically significant result. For example, by conducting multiple versions of an analysis with different covariates, interactions, or even subsets of the data. And again, the consequence of this is an increase in irreproducible results in the literature. All right, so we've been talking a lot about problems that are the root cause of this reproducibility crisis. Now let's switch gears a little bit to more positive things and talk about how we can fix these issues. Now, for me, finding a meaningful solution to this crisis requires a cultural shift towards greater openness, transparency, and collaboration amongst ourselves, amongst researchers. This is essentially synonymous with open science. And it leads me to the second part of my talk, where I want to explain the steps that are involved in doing science in a more transparent and open way. So simply put, open science requires that we improve our research workflow. What's a research workflow? It's the sequence of activities and procedures at different stages of a research project. Now, early career researchers like myself, who are in the game of finding a tenure track position, will often focus on the later stages of this workflow, finding very exciting results, interpreting them, putting them into a nicely packaged story, and then publishing them in a well-respected journal. But we all know that there are many steps, critical steps, that come before these stages. For example, coming up with a scientifically valid and interesting question, and then formulating hypotheses and predictions that flow from this question. Once that's done, and it requires a fair bit of work, we need to think carefully about our experimental and statistical design to test these hypotheses. Now, one way that this can be done in a more transparent and open fashion is via something called preregistration. Now, when I talk about this topic, I guess with the live audience, I usually ask people how many of the audience are familiar with pre-registration, and it's often about 10 to 20% of people. So don't fret if you don't know what this is. I will explain it. Pre-registration is not a mainstream concept in ecology and evolution right now, but it is mandatory for things like clinical trials in medical studies. So if you're funded by NIH, for example, in the US, or if you happen to be a pharmaceutical company conducting clinical trials, you absolutely have to pre-register your studies with the government. What is that? Well, it's the process of making and registering key decisions about the study design and the data analysis early on in the research workflow, before you actually go out and collect the data. So here's an example of what a pre-registration would look like. This is actually a project, one of my own projects that I pre-registered. Just to show you here, this is, so it's essentially a document. It's a research proposal that you, for example, any proposal, just like any proposal you would submit to a PhD evaluation committee or to a funding agency to evaluate the validity of the science you're doing. So instead of doing that, what you would do is archive your proposal on an online platform. In this case, it's the Open Science Framework that is run by the Center for Open Science. And your document essentially gets timestamped. And you can see that here on the screen. My proposal was registered in 2019, 08/17 at 3:38 p.m. And I opted not to make this document public yet. You have the option to do so, but you can also embargo it for a period of time and say, well, I'll make this public when I publish my paper. And the objective here is to be able to show this to editors and reviewers and potentially to readers and say, look, I didn't selectively report results. I didn't p-hack my way into finding these great findings that I'm sharing with you in my publication. I actually intended to do all of this ahead of time. And here's proof that this is actually what I did. So this is what a pre-registration would actually, a form would look like. This is what gets archived on this website. Now, one more formal way to do a pre-registration is via something called registered reports. And they shouldn't be confused. Pre-registrations are very different. They're more flexible than registered reports. Registered reports are a new publication format where peer review happens before the data are collected and analyzed. Now, this might seem a little bit foreign. I'm going to try to explain it with this diagram here. So you would go ahead and develop, let me see if I can get this mouse going on here. Yes, there we go. So you would go ahead and develop your idea, write up your study proposal, and rather than archiving it yourself on a platform, you would send it out to a journal that then sends it out for review. The reviewers would assess it just like they would a regular paper, and then they would provide you with feedback. If your study is complete crap, they'll reject it. If it's good, then you'll probably have a few rounds of back and forth, and then eventually your paper gets accepted. You then go out, collect the data, analyze them, you write your paper, and then it gets submitted for a second stage of review. And at this stage here, the reviewer's task is only to make sure that you follow through with your registered methodology and that your interpretation of your findings is scientifically sound. And then your registered report gets published just like any other paper. What's really important to understand here is that accepted papers are virtually guaranteed publication in the journal if the authors follow through with the registered methodology. So this is really neat because it essentially removes any incentive to selectively report results or p-hack your way into finding significance. This is increasingly popular in psychology and in medicine. It's picking up in ecology and evolution. I saw recently that PLOS Biology, so a fairly well-respected journal, is just announced that they're now publishing registered reports. Last time I looked on the website for the Center for Open Science, there were over 200 journals that published these registered reports. One question that people often have is, well, does pre-registration prevent additional data collection and analyses? And this is obviously really important because researchers like myself included, we often conduct experiments or go out to the field and we will like to observe things. And sometimes we'll notice things that are happening, or we'll collect extra data that we think are really interesting and we want to analyze them and we want to test hypotheses using these data. Is that permitted given that it's not included in the pre-registration or in the registered report? So yes, it is permitted. The answer to the question is no. Non-pre-registered measurements and analyses are allowed, but they have to be labeled as exploratory rather than confirmatory in the publication. And that's because people tend to have more confidence in confirmatory rather than exploratory results. So although it seems quite rigid at first, pre-registration is actually quite a flexible tool for helping us to reduce the prevalence of some of the poor research practices that I mentioned earlier, particularly things like selective reporting and p-hacking. So the third step in our research workflow is data collection. And improving this step can be done by ensuring that we're blind or unaware to the experimental treatments when we collect the data. It can also be improved by carefully documenting the data collection process so that our methods are sufficiently described that anyone else could repeat the study without our help if they wanted to. So blinding is something that most of us are familiar with, but we often fail to implement it in our studies. The classic example is in medical science is the single blind study where subjects are unaware of the treatments that they're receiving, but the doctor knows what's happening. This is obviously no longer allowed in medicine. Obviously, for those of us who work on plants and animals, studies are always single blind, but we should also strive to make them double blind to reduce conscious and unconscious biases that would otherwise affect our results. And this is really important because a recent study in PLOS Biology by some colleagues of mine find that blind protocols are not only very uncommon in the life sciences, but also non-blind studies report higher effect sizes and more significant p-values than studies that are conducted blind. So one example of how this has been implemented recently is by the journal Behavioral Ecology. When authors submit a manuscript to this journal, they have to answer a series of questions, including, does the experimental design exclude the possibility of observer and experimenter bias, for example, by double-blind protocol? If this was not done, explain why, and if it was done, we'll obviously mention it and then explain how it was achieved. And the objective of this is then to let the reviewers and the editors weigh or assess the weight of the evidence that's being presented by the authors. Beyond blinding, carefully describing the materials and methods used is really key to allow others to understand what was done and eventually to replicate our study. So I think this cartoon speaks for itself. In this PhD comic by George Sham, the evil professor says, no, if you make the paper too easy to read, everyone will know how you got the results. But isn't that the objective of a materials and methods section in the first place? So blinding, when it's well implemented, is extremely effective to reduce confirmation bias, and therefore it can contribute to making our workflow more rigorous and credible. Providing a complete and transparent description of the materials and methods also increases the credibility of our results by allowing independent replications. So the last stages of the research workflow I want to mention are data management, so organizing, parsing, and cleaning data, and then conducting statistical analyses, preferably using code or script. I'm going to focus on open data as a means of improving this because that's what I work on, but open code is just as important. So what is data sharing, or open data? It's the process of making data and associated metadata to replicate a study's results publicly accessible on an online repository. Metadata, if this happens to be a new term for you, is data. It's data descriptors, so information about the data for people to understand what is contained in the data set. And I've put at the bottom of this slide here some examples of data repositories that you might be familiar with or that people tend to use in ecology and evolution. So many of you are probably already familiar with these repositories because you would have come across them if you've recently published in a journal that requires data sharing as a condition of publication. These are just some examples of journals with a strong or a mandatory open data policy, meaning that data have to be shared as a condition of publication. And like I said, these are just a few examples. The list is growing larger and larger every day. So it's actually hard now to publish without having to share your data. So why are journals suddenly deciding to implement these policies? Well, because there's many benefits to open data, both for scientists themselves and also for society more broadly. For the scientists who collect data, so data generators, the benefits of sharing them include greater efficiency through better data management, and this obviously has beneficial effects on researchers' productivity. You can also benefit from new collaborations and co-authorships from sharing your data with others. There's the possibility for citations of data sets. So when data sets are published on online repositories, they get a permanent identifier, so a DOI, just like a regular journal publication does. And so when that gets cited, you get increased recognition for the work that you've done. And there's also a few studies documenting that papers that have associated open data sets benefit from a citation advantage over papers that don't share data sets. The benefits for society are potentially even more important. So, for example, sharing data can result or can prevent data being lost to science, because we all know that CDs can be lost, hard drives can be broken, and researchers also retire and they die, and they often go with their data. Open data also accelerates scientific discoveries by allowing researchers to combine data and therefore answer bigger and broader questions. They improve our return per taxpayer research dollar. And this is really important because a lot of our grants and our salaries are paid for with public funds. Open data increase our ability to reproduce and validate results, as we saw earlier. And finally, they also facilitate detecting fraud. If you've been following science news lately, you're probably familiar with this case that has gotten a lot of attention, at least here in Canada. So Jonathan Pruitt is a researcher at McMaster University in Ontario, a province of Canada. And recently his co-authors and his collaborators noticed that there were some very bizarre things happening in the data sets that he had been forced to share as a condition of publication for many of his studies, duplications of data, et cetera, et cetera. So there's ongoing investigations to figure out exactly what happened there. But nonetheless, I think it's important to realize here that had the journals not required data sharing, this would have never been possible. So despite these obvious benefits of open data, it's not easy to get researchers to share their data. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on some of the challenges and solutions to increasing participation in open data, including some of my own work on this topic. In theory, open data is great. You publish your study in a journal, you post your data on a public archive, science progresses, and everyone is happy. In practice, however, that's not really how things are playing out. Many researchers are very reluctant to make their data publicly available, even if they're required to share their data by the journals where they publish. And this pushback seems to be particularly strong in fields like ecology and evolution, where data sets are often complex, they have a long shelf life, and therefore they can be used by their original generators to test multiple hypotheses and eventually publish multiple papers. So some of the reasons why people are reluctant to share their data include the fact that proper data archiving takes time, at least initially, and this is time that's taken away from publishing, which is what funding agencies and universities are rewarding today. There's also fierce competition for publications, so authors might be worried about getting scooped if they share data that they intend to reuse for other publications. Some researchers have legitimate concerns about their data. Are errors being identified in their data sets or their analyses and potentially being shamed publicly. There's also concerns about data misinterpretation and misuse if people wanting to reuse data are not familiar with the study system or the specific methods that were used to collect the data. And then finally, there's just a general lack of recognition for open data in academia right now. So given this pushback, it's interesting to see what the data sharing trends look like in ecology and evolution. And thanks to the work of Tim Vines and others, we know that strong, so mandatory open data policies have actually had a very positive effect on data deposition rates. So journals require data sharing, and as a result, more authors are archiving data sets on these online repositories. But I think it's worth pausing here for a second and asking the question, well, does more actually mean better? Especially since most journals and databases don't actually have the resources to verify the quality of data sets that are being shared, beyond basic checks like making sure that a data availability statement is provided in the paper and that the files that are archived are free of viruses. So I was interested in looking a bit deeper into this question, and so I teamed up with some colleagues from the Australian National University during my postdoc to look at the quality of the data that we're sharing in ecology and evolution. And this led to a paper in PLOS Biology in 2015. So we did this by assessing 100 non-molecular ecology and evolution studies published in journals that had adopted what's called the joint data archiving policy or had their own mandatory open data policy. Oops. And so we looked at 50 papers in 2012 and 50 papers in 2013 that you can see in this table here across 7 different journals. And all these data sets were archived in the repository Dryad, which was one of the first repositories for data in ecology and evolution. So we assessed the quality of these data sets based on 2 different criteria. First of all, their completeness, which is actually what is required by the journal's policy. So essentially, are all the data necessary to reproduce the analyses and the results presented in the paper available in this repository? We also looked at a second criterion, reusability, which is not actually required by the journal's policy. And this has to do more with how easy it is for third parties to do something else with the data or even just understand them. For example, things like, are metadata included? Can you make sense of the data set because the authors provided information about what's in it, basically, abbreviations, units, et cetera, et cetera? Is the format in which the data were shared, does that promote reusability? So we ranked data completeness on a scale of 1 to 5. A score of 5 or 4 meant that the data set actually complied with the basic requirements of the journal's open data policy. And a score of 3 or lower meant that the data set didn't comply with the journal's policy. And we did the same thing for reusability. So here are the results. First, for data completeness. Again, these are 100 studies. We found that more than half, so 56% of these studies didn't meet the minimum requirement of their journal's open data policy. What about data reusability? Where here we found that even more, so 64% of studies were archived in a way that either partially or entirely prevented their reuse. And so I think it's possible to see these results through 2 different lenses. On one hand, I think it's fairly sobering to see that the majority of these data sets that are being shared are totally unusable. On the other hand, there's a bit of light here. I think it's encouraging to see that actually, some data sets at least, and a considerable amount, are actually really high quality. And this is particularly important because was in the early stages of data sharing in ecology and evolution back in 2012 and 2013. And so we're looking at whether this has changed through time with some colleagues right now. In any case, this begs the question, how do we increase participation in high quality data sharing? And there's 2 ways to go about this. You can either use a stick, so enforce journals' policies more aggressively, but this can be difficult because journals and databases don't have the resources and reviewers don't have the time to look at these things. Or you can use the carrot method and reward good behavior. This is a tough nut to crack, and so to try and get at some answers, I recruited more colleagues from the Australian National University to kind of tackle this question. And this was a really fun exercise because I asked people who were very much at opposite ends of the data sharing spectrum. Some people reuse data almost exclusively for their research, and so they're very pro open data. And others are very wary of open data because they study long-term systems, they're empirical researchers, they spend a lot of time and effort writing grants and spending time in the field to collect their data. And so the objective here was to try and meet in the middle and come up with some tangible suggestions to increase participation and alleviate people's concerns about sharing their data. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through these recommendations, but if you're interested in them, please check out the paper. Instead, what I want to do for the last couple minutes is to present you with our latest findings on this question. So we know that some people are worried about sharing their data, and we need to address their concerns to get them on board. But what about people who are okay with sharing? How well are these people doing? And to address this question, I needed help from psychologists because I have no background in psychology. And so I collaborated with researchers from University College London in the UK, and also some colleagues of mine in the Cognitive Science Center at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where I did a postdoc. So I should also mention that a lot of this work was done by Aurelia Green, who was a master's student working with me at the time. She was in psychology. We saw in the earlier slides that I showed you that there was a lot of variation in the quality of open data across those 100 studies that we looked at, both in terms of their completeness and reusability. And so I was interested in understanding what factors might explain the variance in the scores that we obtained. One important aspect that we needed to consider is that data sharing is often perceived as an act of scholarly altruism, where people incur a cost for the benefit of others, in this case for society. And the idea for this project was sparked by a 2014 paper where the authors studied cooperation among humans using online games, online computer games. And their results suggested that humans display what they called a cooperative phenotype that's both domain general and temporally stable, meaning that if you're cooperative in one situation at one point in time, you will also be cooperative in another situation at another point in time. So with this in mind, we asked the question, is it possible that scientists who cooperate more in their everyday lives are also the ones that happen to share more and higher quality research data? And to answer this, we surveyed the 100 researchers who had shared the data for the papers we had looked at previously, and we measured their cooperation in contexts unrelated to data sharing. So my student Aurelia sent them a short survey to fill in, and essentially she was asking them for help with their research. And we looked at the response time it took these researchers to complete the survey. The survey was a standard psychology questionnaire that's used to measure self-report altruism. So how altruistic people are in a range of different situations. And we also, at the end of the survey, when people were done completing it, we entered the respondents into a draw to win a $500 cash prize for participating. And then they had the option either to keep that money for themselves or to donate either a part or all of those $500 to a charity of their choice. And because we wanted to make sure we had as many responses as possible, we took great care to personalize the survey request that we sent out to the researchers based on the time zones where they were located. We mentioned the author's research in our email because researchers like it when you tell them about their research, or you at least tell them that you've read it. And we sent 3 reminders at 1-week intervals. And through all this work, we actually got an incredibly high response rate for this type of research. 52 out of the 100 researchers responded to our survey. And FYI, we pre-registered all of this methodology and the statistics we were going to do on the Open Science Framework. So to analyze our data, we use a multivariate Bayesian model to look at covariation between traits related to cooperation in the context of data sharing and in contexts unrelated to data sharing. Our model had a few fixed effects in there. We controlled for gender, years out of PhD, and also 3 personality traits that the psychologists thought would be potentially important in influencing whether people share their data or not. So social desirability, conscientiousness, and collectivism. So here are some of the results. First, quickly, just to mention some of the fixed effects, there was not much happening, actually. We saw that donations increased with years out of PhD. This kind of makes sense because you get richer, or usually you tend to get richer the further out of your PhD you are. Response time decreased with conscientiousness. That also makes sense. And we saw that response time increased with social desirability. So we interpreted this as people wanting to be viewed favorably by others, but potentially being less genuine about their cooperation, took more reminders in order to participate in our survey. Okay, so here are the more interesting results of this analysis. This is a correlation plot that shows relationships between measures of, let's see if I can get this mouse to work again. Measures of cooperation in the context of data sharing, underlined in green. And then here we have measures of cooperation in context unrelated to data sharing. And we found that there was a tight relationship between data completeness and data reusability, which is perhaps not so surprising. What we were surprised to find, though, is absolutely no, or at least no indication of any strong relationships between any of the other variables that we measured. So let me just quickly mention some strengths and weaknesses of the study. First of all, these were real-world instances of cooperation. And so unlike previous studies that had predominantly used these online computer games and kind of artificial settings, we think that this is fairly relevant in terms of actually looking at what people are doing in their real lives. Importantly, we focused on the quality of the data that were being shared, not just whether people shared something or nothing. But one of the limitations, obviously, of this study, because this is quite difficult to do, is the sample size. So we had a fairly limited sample size of 52 respondents, especially for a complicated model like this multivariate Bayesian model. So I wanted to conduct a simpler analysis with greater power to check whether our results would hold in a simpler context. So here we looked at the difference in data completeness and data reusability between people that had responded to our survey and people that had not responded. So essentially that was a measure of cooperation. People who took the time out of their day to respond to our survey were considered as cooperative, and people who either ignored our survey and the multiple requests for help from Aurelia were considered as less cooperative. And what did we find? Absolutely no difference between the two groups, both in terms of data completeness and data reusability. So this analysis tends to support the one that I showed you in the previous slide. So does this mean that the idea of a cooperative phenotype doesn't apply to real-life context and doesn't extend to data sharing? We don't think so. It's not that cooperative people suddenly aren't so helpful when it comes to data sharing. Instead, I think our data suggests that nice people can't share, or at least they're not any better at sharing than people who act less cooperatively and report themselves as less altruistic. To me, the most likely explanation for this result is that even though most of us might be well-intended cooperative scientists, we don't have proper training in data management. So even if we want to share our data, we're not very effective at doing this. We don't have the skills to do this well. And the good news is that there's an easy fix for this: provide more training. And this seems like a pretty obvious and simple solution, but there's little empirical data actually suggesting that training is really important. So fortunately for us, there's lots of initiatives already that exist to teach scientists how to be better at managing their data. These are just two examples. You might be familiar with data carpentry in the US. Foster is a European initiative. But all that to say, things are looking fairly bright, I think, for the future. And the time is just about right to see whether these initiatives are having a positive effect on the quality of the data that's being shared by researchers. Okay, so it's definitely time for me to conclude. If there's one take-home message from this talk, it should be that curbing the reproducibility crisis will require that we make some pretty considerable improvements to our research workflow. An excellent way to do this is by adopting more transparent, open science practices that increase the credibility, reproducibility, and reusability of our research data, while also accelerating scientific discovery. There's obviously challenges to implementing these measures, but all of them, I think, have pretty easy fixes. And we're seeing some dramatic progress in the last couple of years with many funding agencies, journals, and researchers getting on board the open science movement. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm sure Al will figure out a way for me to take questions if there are any.
All right, Dom. Great. Thank you very much. I'm sure people are applauding out there in internet land. That was yeah, very thought-provoking. I'm sure will be the basis of some lab meetings in the future, and I'm sure the recording will get downloaded a lot of times for people to have a look at. Let me, as people sort of think of some questions, let me just use my position as sharing to ask you a question. I was, when you were talking about your registered reports, I was thinking, you know, for an NSF grant, I have to write a 15-page explanation of what I want to do, and that gets reviewed, and hopefully at some point we get funding. Can we be thinking about grant proposals that are obviously done before any data collection, or should we be making more use of them as registered reports to sort of show that these are the things we were thinking of before we did the data collection and analysis?
Yes, I mean, that's essentially what a registered report is like, except, well, you actually, no, I mean, it's pretty much essentially what it is. You write an introduction, and it doesn't have to be necessarily the exact introduction that you're going to use in your paper. You're obviously allowed to refine that later on if you want to, but you do that anyways in a grant proposal, right? You write a background section to explain why it is you're going to do what you're going to do, you know, how you're going to collect your data, how you're planning on analyzing them, hopefully. The difference, I guess, is that these, you know, these grant proposals, obviously they're reviewed by your peers, they get funded or not, basically, but they kind of disappear in the ether afterwards, right? They remain with the author and with the funding agency. Whereas the advantage of actually using all this work you've put into this, writing this grant proposal, is that you can then submit it to a journal. And the journal will tell you then afterwards, okay, well, you might get more feedback beyond what you got from the granting agency. And the really neat thing, like I said, is that your study might get accepted before you even do it. And obviously, one of the big concerns that people have is that, you know, if you're going out to the field, if you're doing experiments in the lab, things never work out exactly as you had planned, right? That's just a fact of life, basically. And that's fine. Reviewers, editors understand that, and it's not a problem for registered reports. You just have to be very transparent about what happened. And there's discussion now exactly about how to present that. I think right now the community is leaning towards having just a separate document, not to kind of clog up the actual manuscript, because you want that to still be, you know, readable at the end of the day. But having a separate document that says, look, this is what I intended to do, this is what ended up happening, and the links between the two and the reasons why things happened the way they did.
Great. Anybody else want to unmute themselves? I see Sarah, you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I have a question. Really great talk, Dom. Really interesting. I think I was pretty naive to the crisis that is actually going on there. I was curious in maybe any of the replicability studies that you looked at, if there was an actual, or if you saw any kind of relationship with an actual statistician being on the paper, maybe as some sort of quality control compared to maybe students and advisors that aren't specific to stats, trying to do their stats on their own and maybe making mistakes.
Right. So Jill, let me just repeat the question to see if I understand it correctly. Whether you think so, their question is, could it be that part of this reproducibility crisis is driven by the fact that, you know, students and people who are not statisticians are conducting the analyses, and would it help if we had statisticians involved?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. I think that, you know, we can't think of this reproducibility or replication crisis as, you know, evil researchers wanting to fake their data or fraud. Like, fraud is a very small proportion of the irreproducible results that are out there. Most of what's happening right now is that's right. You know, we have to wear multiple hats as researchers, and it's difficult to be an expert at all of these things. We have to be very creative and think about ideas and come up with great questions and experimental designs. Then we have to, you know, be great in the field or in the lab to collect all our data. Then we have to be fantastic at doing these statistics that are now becoming increasingly complex, right? I mean, people write in their papers all the time, they're doing GLMMs, but GLMMs are an active area of research in statistics. Nevertheless, we're using them all the time, right? And we have very little background in those fields. Then we also have to be great at writing these papers, basically. So yeah, I think, you know, some steps that some universities are taking is to actually hire on statistical consultants. That, you know, there are some in many universities, but they're not as involved as they should be. And oftentimes they come from a mathy background, and they're not really trained to help us biologists work with the types of questions that we are asking. And so I think there needs to be an awakening on behalf of kind of department heads to realize that, yeah, you know, actually sometimes students in biology or postdocs who are really good at statistics are the best candidates actually for helping others out. And there needs to be, in my opinion, positions created for these people, permanent positions, to be there in the departments to help you know, grad students and postdocs or PIs who want that statistical consulting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. There's a question from Rachel here on the chat. I don't know whether she can't access her mic, but I'll read it out to you.
Yeah.
Much of her, I don't know whether you can see it as well.
Yeah, I just opened it now. Yeah.
Okay, so she's talking about using publicly available data sets from NOAA that are already online. She works with those data and writes about in the methods. Should she sort of be posting those data, or just sort of point people towards the online repository she got it from in the first place?
That is such an excellent question. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier in this talk, I didn't have time to include these results because I already went over time. I have a student right now looking at how the quality of data sets is changing over time. We're looking at 375 papers. And one of the things my students are coming across, so one student and a few others, is that sometimes that's right, people use data sets that are already public. So they might be from NOAA, they might be from the IUCN, they might be from eBird, they might be from, there's tons of you know, repositories now or online databases that make data public. And it's great that researchers are using these data to carry out studies and publish papers and generate more evidence. One of the issues we're running into sometimes is that people will, that's right, link or just say, I use data from this database, but they don't provide enough information to actually find the specific data that they used in their analyses. That's problematic. Especially if, for example, you say, well, I used the data from 2016 on these species, but then the database is continually updating these data basically. And so if you go and look on the database right now in 2020, you can't go back in time. There's no archive of what the data were like in 2016 or 2018. And that's a real problem from a reproducibility perspective, because nobody can reproduce your results basically. And so in that respect, if you can get the, or if it's allowed, if that repository allows you to archive the specific data set you use, and oftentimes they have no issue with it, you should definitely do that. There's no issue with it. You just have to look at the license that they use often for these data sets. So you could probably put it up on Zenodo or Dryad or Figshare and just say that these data sets are, you know, the data were taken from, I don't know, IUCN or NOAA basically in this year. You can also talk to some of these repositories and let them know that it's important to have an archive where people can go back in time, because if the data are continually updated, then it's great that data are updated, but at the same time, from a reproducibility perspective, it creates issues.
Great. The question from Jean here about whether journals are having problems finding reviewers who would be able to, it's always hard to find reviewers, but somebody who'll commit to that stage 1 pre-registration step and a stage 2, given that stage 2 may not happen.
I think it is. I think you're right that it is a greater commitment on behalf of the reviewers, because they're obviously going to see at least 2 versions of the paper. Nevertheless, like that can also be the case for a regular publication too, right? Like papers would get like a reject, resubmit, major revisions. And so you might see a paper come through multiple times through the kind of standard review process right now. I guess it's hard to tell right now at this point. I don't think there's enough data basically to figure out whether this is actually going to impose more work on reviewers. I think you might even be more likely to get reviewers right now to help out with these registered reports, because they're new and they favor kind of reproducibility. And so in that sense, I think that at least the people I talk to who operate in, you know, within that space are really keen to have a look at these things.
Great. I'm not seeing any more in the chat. Okay, Chris.
Yeah, can I ask you a quick question? Thanks, I really appreciate your time on this. I'm jumping back and forth in another meeting. But one of the things I was interested in that you didn't spend any time on is the economics behind this, the publishing companies and the funding agencies. And I think one of the limitations that I see students having in even putting things into Dryad is the cost.
Absolutely.
The cost they have to pay Dryad and the cost that it takes them in their time or in having to find someone to help them to prepare the data. And I think this is really why we see data sets that are just thrown at the last minute into Dryad that aren't doing well. This is why a lot of the data in GVIP is quite poor. And so my question is, do you think, and have you spoken with anyone based on your experience here, that we can mandate funding agencies and even as institutions administratively provide funding to students and young researchers to allow them to do this and even force them to do this, so that if you write an NSF grant for 500, you have to put 50 into your data management statement. It's not just a throwaway one-pager, and show how your budget line is going to allow you to both prepare your data and put it online. And that at least, you know, half of your publications have to be open access publications. If you can speak to that, please.
Yes, excellent question. Lots of content in it. I'm not going to talk about the open access side of things because, you know, paying for open access, that's a whole other can of worms. But to kind of address your point about first of all, the cost of sharing data. So right now, the only repository that charges to archive data is Dryad, and that happened, I can't remember when it was, 2013 or 12 or 13. And I think that was a big mistake on behalf of Dryad. It's their current model right now. I think it's $90 US to archive a data set. Some journals, if you get your paper published in a journal, the journal will cover those fees for you, but that requires acceptance, right? And I've written a little piece at some point about that being problematic, because I think it's hard enough to get people to share their data. If you charge them to share on top of it, forget it. Like, how is that an incentive, right? That being said, so I haven't used Dryad in years for that reason. I don't want to spend $90 to share my data. There are other repositories that are supported by funding agencies. For example, Zenodo is a really good one in Europe. Figshare has this like public-private model where they sell certain like data management tools to institutions, but they use that money to make data sharing free for researchers, basically. So that's kind of my answer to the first part of your question. The second part of your question is absolutely, should this be supported by funding agencies in terms of helping researchers pay for staff to or students to manage the data? Yes, absolutely. That's something that comes up over and over when I discuss these issues with researchers. They'll say, look, yes, I'm happy to share my data, but I just don't have time. I have all these other things to do, and I don't have money. And so I think funding agencies, universities have to listen to that, because if you're starting to require data management plans from researchers and institutions, as is the case in the US and is happening this year in Canada, funding agencies have to realize that they need to support this. It's not enough to put in an extra requirement on researchers. There needs to be resources to allow this to happen. The exact mechanisms, those still need to be figured out. But I think it's not just that here's a $500,000 grant from the NSF. You need to take a chunk of that to manage your data. There needs to be added money on top of what's already given to researchers, because it's a new requirement. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, fine. Laura, I saw you unmuted at one point. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do. Hi. Awesome talk. I have a question more tailored to like early career researchers. So kind of like what Al was asking, if you already have an NSF proposal and it's been accepted, and then you have to put it through this pre-registration process in a journal or any other proposal that has gone through a funding agency, or in the case of PhD students or PhD committees, right? We have a public proposal defense that it's judged by at least 5 different doctors. How do you think adding this pre-registration step would delay publication for early career researchers that need publications to then get postdocs?
So the benefits of registered reports is you can actually put the paper in your CV as accepted before you go out and carry out the research. In terms of the time requirements, you would obviously want to get the feedback probably from your committee before you would send this off as a registered report, right? Not as a pre-registration, that's different, but as a registered report to a journal. And then a lot of journals right now, if you read their websites, they'll say that they really try to get the feedback to you relatively quickly, because they understand that you can't wait 6 months to go and carry out your study, right? So the first stage of the review process is, according to journals, expedited, basically, and they try to do it as fast as possible. And then once that's done and you get your acceptance, you know, in terms of finding jobs later on, well, you can write, look, this is a registered report, it's accepted. I haven't actually collected the data yet if that's the case, but hopefully, you know, by the time you're looking for a postdoc, you will have, and you'll have written it up. But it's pretty nice. Like if I was to review your CV to hire you for a postdoc or something like that, then I would look at that and say, oh, well, okay, well, obviously this is a pretty solid study. It's been reviewed already. It's not completely finalized, but, you know, provided they follow through with what they said they were going to do, it's going to get published.
Thank you. That's very cool. Thanks.
I just saw a comment here that so Dryad is now charging $150 to $200 for papers. That might very well be true. Honestly, I haven't looked in ages because I don't submit to Dryad anymore. I don't really feel like being.
All right, just one last call out. I'm not seeing any more chats or any more people unmuting. Speak now or. All right, Dom, I think we're done, but lots of things for people to think about. So thanks again for doing this. Really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing more publications on this topic.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for the excellent questions. It was fun, and yeah, I enjoyed this this experience on Zoom. Great to virtually meet you all, and yeah, thanks again for spending the time to listen in on this talk.
Right. Thanks, Dom.
Take care.